The records speak of a wind-carved valley where a man named Enoch Barron arrived with three quiet young men, Orion, Calder, and Matthias boys who followed him like shadows stitched to his boots. Witnesses recall how they moved in perfect silence, glancing at him before every breath, every step, every word they dared to speak. Men in the settlement saw discipline. Others sensed something colder, something rehearsed. No one understood then that the cabin Enoch built in that forgotten valley wasn't a sanctuary dot, it was a fortress. And the boys inside weren't students. They were captives orbiting one man's obsession with obedience, purity, and absolute control. Years later, when the truth finally surfaced, hardened men swore the air itself felt different, like the valley had been holding its breath the entire time, waiting for someone to finally look behind the walls Enoch had built. And what they found still shakes those who remember. If you're into deep, cinematic true story breakdowns, stories that get under your skin and stay there, hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you think. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing where the crew is tuning in from. The first reports about Black Ridge Fortress talk about a concrete block pressed against the sky, a place where men vanished into training and came back leaner, quieter, and strangely obedient. They called it a leadership academy on paper, a remote correctional program for troubled but capable men. Yet descriptions always ended the same way, with long pauses and a look that never relaxed again. Records from the nearest town show supply trucks climbing the switchbacks at dawn, bringing food, medicine, and fuel, then rolling back empty, leaving engine echoes and the fortress staring down like a blank verdict. At the center of those records stands one name, Commander Aver Holt, a former officer whose doctrine turned discipline into something worshipped, feared and rarely challenged by the men forced to march beneath him. According to surviving recruits, the first day began with silence, no greetings, no orientation, just a line of men under floodlights while Holt walked past, measuring each face like a craftsman studying uncut stone. Among those men was Adrian Cole, 28, broad-shouldered from factory work, carrying a file stamped insubordinate but promising. A man sent there by a judge who believed structure might finally tame him. The bus door opened, and the air hit him like metal, thin and cold, smelling of diesel, wet concrete, and distant pine, while watchtowers watched him back through glass, reflecting nothing but gray sky. Inside, the halls were bare, painted in the kind of white that never looked clean, lined with numbered doors, as if names were already a distraction from the man each recruit was supposed to become. The first rule on the wall read, "Your past is irrelevant," followed by the second, "Your voice belongs to a program," a sentence Adrian replayed every night in the bunk room that first month. Men who watched him arrive remember how quickly the fortress swallowed him. Uniform issued, hair shaved, bunk assigned, voice reduced to yes sir, no sir, until even his footsteps matched the rhythm everyone followed. The daily schedule began at 4 with sirens and steel doors, then drills in the yard until lungs burned, lectures about loyalty and obedience, meals in silence, and evaluations that dissected every gesture and hesitation. On the surface, it resembled but familiar training, the kind used in elite units, yet differences crept in. Extra hours of staring drills and phrases about duty repeated until the men barely felt human. Internal memos later recovered show Holt believed repetition could strip a man to his frame and rebuild him, not just as a soldier, but as an instrument that never questioned the hand gripping the handle. Older recruits who survived early phases became wardens, men like Barrett and Sloan, enforcing rules with clipped words, long stares, and punishments that sounded minor but felt like the world shrinking to a pinhole. Punishment meant isolation runs in the freezing yard, extra drills under floodlights until legs shook, days without speaking to another man, silence making breathing loud and thoughts louder, obedience becoming the only real relief available. Adrian tried to play along at first, counting days, memorizing routine, telling himself it was temporary, but the fortress blurred time, turning weeks into something like one long gray, exhausted afternoon stretched without edges. What unsettled him most were disappearances, not dramatic or announced, just an empty bunk after evening roll call. A name erased from the roster, and the way everyone pretended they had never heard it. One man, Darius Knox, tall, restless, always tapping his fingers, whispered about leaving on his own terms. Maybe walking down the mountain at night, yet the next morning his bed and locker were clear. Official notes spoke of reassignments and transfers, but surviving men insist no transport arrived those nights. Only footsteps in the corridor, doors opening softly, and orders for remaining recruits to tighten ranks and celebrate progress. Somewhere during that first winter, Adrian started keeping track in his head. Counting missing faces, cataloging which questions earned extra drills, noticing how Holt studied not just performance, but the exact point where defiance folded. He remembered one lecture clearly, Holt at a blackboard, explaining that a strong program needed successors, men who had survived the grind and embraced it, capable of leading others without ever hesitating over issued orders. In that moment, Adrian realized the fortress was not only training followers, it was hunting future wardens, selecting men once labeled problematic and reshaping them into instruments of the same system that ground them down. According to later psychiatric reports, this was the true genius of Black Ridge, turning rebellion into a resource, convincing certain men that the highest freedom was administering rules that had once pinned them to concrete. Snow piled against outer walls while inside the routine never shifted. Boots on concrete, shouted counts, hands slapping cold steel bars during exercises, every sound merging into one metallic heartbeat pulsing through the structure. At night, Adrian lay awake on his bunk, eyes on the cracked ceiling, listening to the fortress breathe, steam hissing in pipes, doors clanging, footsteps above, as if the building itself paced through sleepless thoughts. One evening, sent to deliver inventory sheets, he found a side corridor he had never noticed, unlit, floor dusty, doors marked by letters instead of numbers. The air colder there, heavy with buried arguments. The handle on the final door felt warm, as if someone had just left, and when Adrian leaned close, he heard nothing. Only his own pulse, hard, insistent, drumming like a fist against his ribs. Later, when investigators traced his story, they marked that corridor as the first documented crack in Holt's design. The moment one recruit sensed there were places even insiders were never meant to see clearly. From that night on, Adrian stopped insisting it was just a tough program and studied the place like a living opponent. Tracking patrols, memorizing blind spots, testing how much pressure each rule could absorb. Men who trained beside him say his eyes changed first, less dazed, more focused, as if he had chosen something inside himself the program could not reach. A line he refused to let Holt redraw. The first stories about River Camp came from fishermen who swore the tree line felt wrong, as if the forest leaned inward to listen whenever new men arrived with their duffels and quiet, restless eyes. The camp sat on gravel banks beside a slow black river, a cluster of wooden barracks built by former loggers, now repurposed into a reform site for men who had run out of second chances elsewhere. Its overseer, Marshal Kate Rourke, was a man carved from discipline and suspicion, a veteran whose silence carried more weight than any shouted command other programs used to keep their recruits aligned. He believed men could be remade by stripping them of noise, comfort, and expectation until only the essential remained, a philosophy taught with calm precision rather than threats or visible anger. The men who arrived learned fast that comfort vanished first, replaced by long days hauling timber, repairing docks, and running drills that began before sunrise and ended long after the forest swallowed the last light. One of the newest arrivals was Lennox Hawley, a former street fighter who had lived half his life ducking consequences, now sent here by a judge who hoped the river might cool his temper. Lennox stepped off the transport boat expecting brutality, yet River Camp welcomed him with something stranger, a quiet so complete it felt engineered, as if silence itself were mandatory uniform. Men walked in synchronized patterns, speaking only when essential, tools passing hand to hand without banter, the entire camp moving like a single organism afraid of disturbing whatever listened from the woods. The first meal revealed the rules without a word spoken. Men eating in perfect order, bowls placed down simultaneously, every gesture measured. Lennox watching and wondering when someone would finally break formation. Marshal Rourke entered last, boots heavy with river mud, eyes scanning the room not for troublemakers but for weakness, as if he expected the camp to collapse from inside one man at a time. Lennox felt that gaze like a weight, steady and impersonal, judging potential rather than guilt, something that unsettled him more than threats ever had during his years fighting under neon lights. River Camp's first week tested endurance in ways Lennox hadn't imagined, hiking endless ridges, splitting frozen logs, memorizing routes through the forest until he could navigate blindfolded with only breath and instinct guiding him. But beneath the physical strain lay another pressure. Routines timed with mathematical precision, conversations restricted to brief confirmations, every moment structured so nothing spontaneous could survive inside those gravel boundaries. Some men embraced the system quickly, craving its order, while others, like Lennox, felt friction in their bones, a growing tension between who they had been and the silent obedience demanded now. One man, Bram Keller, towered over the others yet rarely spoke, a gentle giant who folded under the routine with surprising ease, performing every task flawlessly but carrying sadness like a second skin. Lennox befriended Bram by accident during a dock repair shift, both men working knee-deep in cold river water, exchanging nods that eventually turned into whispered comments about splinters and stubborn nails. Their conversations remained short by necessity, but they formed a rhythm. Two men reclaiming fragments of themselves beneath the camp's relentless quiet, each gesture a small rebellion against imposed uniformity. Over time, Lennox noticed peculiar details, lights from the old watchtower, flickering at hours, no one admitted to patrolling, shadows moving near the tree line without footsteps, and logs marked for cutting repeatedly left untouched. Rumors spread in silent glances rather than words. Stories about the previous group of men who supposedly completed the program yet left behind no letters, no tracks, and no official graduation records. Marshal Rourke dismissed questions with a raised eyebrow, a gesture that said curiosity was corrosion, something that weakened discipline, and Lennox quickly learned to lock his uncertainties behind clenched teeth. But uncertainty grew legs quickly in River Camp, especially at night when the wind traced the barracks like fingers and the river whispered sounds too, rhythmic to be natural water movement. One evening, Bram shook Lennox awake, pointing toward the tree line where a lone figure stood unmoving, posture stiff, staring at the barracks as if counting the men inside one by one. By the time guards responded, the figure had slipped back into the dark, footprints vanishing into pine needles, the only evidence of lingering coldness that crept beneath the barracks floorboards. The next morning routines resumed as if nothing happened. Yet the men's glances changed, sharper, their movements tighter, the camp absorbing fear and transforming it into stricter adherence to silence. Lennox confronted Bram during timber duty, whispering questions. But Bram only shook his head and murmured that the river kept memories longer than men did, a warning without explanation. The strangeness intensified when a recruit named Mercer disappeared after night drills. His bunk stripped, boots missing, logbook erased, the camp treating his absence like an administrative correction rather than a human loss. Lennox tried asking Rourke directly, a reckless move, yet the marshal only studied him for a long, heavy moment before saying some men leave when they realize discipline demands everything. From then on, Lennox felt watched, not from the tower, but from the forest itself, a presence behind the tree line that sensed hesitation and waited for cracks in his resolve to widen. He and Bram quietly prepared themselves, mapping escape routes, noting guard rotations, memorizing which bundles of rope were least likely to snap, playing without speaking the word escape even once. What neither man realized was that the camp had been studying them too, tracking deviations, marking confidence spikes, predicting when the idea of running would bloom strong enough to act upon. By the month's end, tension thickened like storm air. Men waking before alarms, Rourke pacing with sharper eyes, the river flowing faster as if anticipating something it had seen many times before. The iron bridge ran across a canyon, so deep men swore wind sounded different there, carrying voices that didn't belong to anyone standing on the rusted metal plates bolted into the cliff. Locals claimed the bridge shifted after midnight, as if testing its own strength, Bolts creaking like old bones, echoes rippling down the canyon walls long after the sound should have died. At the center of every rumor stood Warden Jacques Rodin, a solitary man who oversaw the old transport outpost built beside the bridge, maintaining order among the rotating crews assigned there. Rodin didn't smile, didn't joke, and didn't entertain questions. He enforced discipline with a calm that rattled even hardened workers, as if the bridge's weight lived inside his chest. Men coasted there lasted weeks before requesting reassignment, complaining of sleepless nights, strange vibrations, or the sense that the bridge watched them more than they watched it during patrol shifts. Into this environment arrived Nolan Creed, a new recruit with a temper he tried hard to bury, assigned here after repeated warnings from commanders who believed isolation might steady him. Nolan expected harsh work, not the unsettling quiet that greeted him or the way other men avoided the windows after sundown, claiming the canyon produced shapes disguised as shadows. First inspection revealed a camp too orderly, tools aligned perfectly, boots polished despite long hours, as if someone obsessed over eliminating irregularities no man admitted caring about. The workers themselves moved with tired precision, conversations clipped, eyes drifting toward the bridge even during meals, each man carrying tension like a suspended rope waiting to snap. Nolan befriended Ezra Var early on, a wiry night shift guard with quick hands and quicker instincts, the only man willing to whisper warnings to anyone new. Ezra explained that certain noises on the bridge weren't mechanical, and that some nights the metal carried footsteps even when every guard could account for every man on duty. The warden, however, dismissed the tailies, insisting the bridge expanded and contracted naturally, though his insistence seemed too practiced to be entirely sincere. Nolan noticed other irregularities, missing logs, erased entries, patrol reports with overlapping timestamps, suggesting someone edited or rewrote information long after the shifts had ended. Equipment malfunctioned in patterns too consistent to be coincidence, flashlights dying at the same hour, radios buzzing with static that sounded almost like distant muttering. Despite his skepticism, Nolan found himself studying the bridge during dusk, watching how the metal darkened as temperatures dropped, appearing almost alive under the growing haze. During one patrol, he felt a vibration beneath his boots, subtle but steady, like someone pacing slowly along the opposite end despite no visible movement. Ezra admitted he had felt the same pulse before, warning Nolan never to stand center span after midnight, a rule all veteran crewmen followed without argument. Rodin continued acting unbothered, though Nolan began noticing how the Warden's patrols always avoided the bridge after dark, his steps shifting whenever wind pushed too cold across the rails. One evening, a veteran worker named Holt vanished without leaving gear behind, his bunk neatly made, logbook missing, and boots left lying precisely beneath the frame. The warden claimed Holt received emergency reassignment, yet no transport log supported the explanation, and men whispered that Holt had walked onto the bridge when the canyon was loudest. Nolan and Ezra began tracking shifts together, marking subtle changes, bolts turning 0.5 millimeter, metal plates warming unexpectedly, and faint impressions on dusted surfaces near the midspan rail. These observations built toward a pattern, one that suggested the bridge was being crossed, but never by men assigned to the outpost during those recorded hours. On the 12th night, during a sudden temperature drop, the creaking intensified, echoing like strained breath, and Nolan swore he saw a silhouette pause near the far railing. Ezra ran a thermal scan, but found no heat signature, yet the silhouette lingered, shifting slightly, as if listening to something beneath the bridge rather than above it. When they advanced, the shape dissolved into the wind, leaving fresh scuff marks on the steel marks too defined to be illusions created by shadows alone. Riordan reprimanded both men for unauthorized pursuit, though guilt flickered behind his eyes when confronted about the marks and the incomplete logs. Later that night, Riordan locked himself in the control tower, pacing under flickering lights, muttering about timing and thresholds, words carried through ventilation grates. Nolan quietly listened near. Storm clouds rolled in, turning the canyon into a black hollow swallowing sound, while the bridge shook with a rhythm too deliberate to be weather alone. Ignoring protocol, Nolan and Ezra approached the midspan, following fresh impressions glistening under rain, each print heavier than the last, stopping abruptly near a broken railing segment. From the darkness below rose a low, metallic groan, stretching upward like breath, and the bridge shuddered, cables snapping against wind like warning whips directed at trespassers. In that moment, Nolan understood the outpost wasn't guarding the bridge. The bridge was testing the outpost, studying the patterns of men assigned there, learning their limits nightly. When they retreated, Ezra whispered that Holt had likely reached the same conclusion, and that Rorden's silence hid knowledge older than the outpost itself. By dawn, the bridge stood still again, silent and cold, as if the night's movements had never happened, though Nolan felt something watching from the canyon depths, waiting for another step. Hollow Signal Station sat on a cliff of broken shale, a skeletal relay tower rising above it, blinking red against the fog like an exhausted eye, refusing to close despite years of strained vigilance. The station once served as a communication hub for mountain patrol units, but shifting routes left it isolated, staffed by rotating crews of men sent there for discipline, recovery, or simple disappearance from crowded barracks. Men arriving at Hollow Station always remarked on the radio static first, a ceaseless whispering hum threading through every wall, rattling frames, vibrating floorboards, and unsettling even the toughest patrol veterans. Commander Ren Kelder oversaw the place, a gaunt man with a voice that rarely rose above conversational tone, carrying authority not through volume but through the certainty carved into every measured word. Calder's rules focused on vigilance, demanding constant monitoring of frequencies no one admitted understanding, though he insisted the signals carried potential threats requiring absolute attention and unwavering discipline. Into this regiment arrived Mason Driel, a former mechanic with a reputation for stubbornness, now assigned to the station after conflicts with superiors who believed isolation might sharpen his focus. Mason noticed immediately how the men at Hollow moved, shoulders tight, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights spent listening to the static crawl across channels like claws dragging along metal. His roommate, a veteran named Thorne, rarely spoke but carried dark circles that made him look perpetually haunted, often sitting upright at night as if waiting for something to address him directly. During his first shift, Mason studied the equipment outdated, patched with improvised wiring, dials marked with pencil, screens flickering as though reacting to unseen breath brushing their surfaces. Static formed patterns that felt intentional, bursts rising and falling with unnatural rhythm, drawing Mason's attention even when he tried focusing on maintenance tasks instead of the strange pulsing frequencies. Calder insisted the signals were remnants of old military chatter bouncing through atmospheric layers. Yet his eyes tightened whenever a particular high-frequency burst echoed through the narrow monitoring chamber. The men rotated duties in pairs, never alone. But Mason soon realized the rule wasn't for safety on the equipment it was imposed, so no one listened too long without someone to break the trance. Thorne warned him quietly that staying tuned too long made men hear names whispered back at them, names spoken with perfect clarity, despite the static's grinding distortion. Mason dismissed the superstition until a night shift when he leaned too close to a receiver and swore he heard his own surname stretched through the static like a thin, trembling wire. That moment tightened something inside him, a cold recognition that the station recorded more than transmissions. It felt like it waited for responses, as if expecting acknowledgement from men monitoring it. Tensions grew each week as men rotated out unexpectedly, their bunks stripped, gear removed, reports stamped reassigned, despite the transport logs showing no scheduled evacuations on corresponding dates. Mason questioned Caldor about the missing men, but the commander simply noted that Hollow Station attracted instability and those unwilling to commit fully to vigilance. Thorne confided that men taken by the frequencies didn't argue, simply walked out during night storms toward the tower's base, never returning, their absence quietly folded into administrative notes. One evening, the static shifted sharply during Mason's shift, forming pulses almost resembling Morse patterns. Though the rhythm was too fast, like something impatient scraping for attention, Ezra Pohl, a recruit assigned to work beside Mason, froze when the pulses repeated, whispering that the pattern had called another man 2 months earlier on the night he vanished. Mason recorded the pattern manually, but when he checked the log later, the entry was erased, replaced by Calder's handwriting stating, "System tests, no significant anomalies detected." That lie sharpened Mason's focus, convincing him the commander wasn't controlling the station as much as maintaining an uneasy relationship with whatever pulsed through its wires. During a severe storm, the station lights flickered, shadows twisting across metal cabinets, and the static rose in pitch until it resembled strained breathing pressed through narrow vents. Calder ordered all men to the main hall, claiming unstable voltage, though his voice cracked slightly, betraying fear Mason had never seen in him before. As thunder rolled, the tower outside shook visibly, its red beacon flickering faster, casting brief silhouettes of men standing at the cliff's edge, silhouettes that belonged to no one inside the hall. Thorne grabbed Mason's arm, insisting the station was responding to the storm, calling men already lost to step back into formation, echoing routines none of them remembered learning. When the static suddenly dropped into absolute silence, every man stopped breathing, as if the world had snapped taut and waited for the next movement with collective tension. Then a single transmission cut through the dead air, a voice without tone saying, "Ready," followed by a series of footsteps on an inactive channel. None of them had touched. Calder collapsed to his knees, whispering that the cycle was restarting. That hollow station was never abandoned, but merely sleeping until men triggered its forgotten rhythms. Mason made a decision then, grabbing Thorne and leading him toward the emergency stairwell despite alarms blaring, convinced that staying meant joining whatever roster filled the unstated vacancies. They ran into wind thick with static, the tower crackling above like a beacon transmitting without power. Each step carrying them farther from the station's unseen pull pressing at their backs. When they reached the lower ridge and looked back, they saw Calder standing in the doorway, unmoving, illuminated by red pulses that flickered like acknowledgement from something inside the tower. By dawn, the tower fell silent again, its light steady, the station calm. Yet Mason swore the cliff still hummed faintly, as if waiting for new men to answer its call again.